The Holy Gospel according to John.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Then Jesus said to those who believed in him,
"If you live according to my teaching, you really are my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free."
They answered,
We are descendants of Sarah and Abraham. Never have we been slaves of anyone. What do you mean by saying, you'll be free?
Well, Jesus answered them,
The truth of the matter is, everyone who lives in sin is the slave of sin. Now, a slave doesn't always remain part of a household. An heir, however, is a member of that house forever. So, if the heir, the only begotten Son, makes you free, you will be free indeed.
the gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Please be seated. Well, you may have noticed today that we had all 4 readings, including the Psalms. So something from the Hebrew Scriptures, an epistle, a gospel, and a psalm. And this is probably the first time that this has happened in the last year and a half. So it's kind of a big deal today. Now, we've, of course, been paring back some of these readings early on in the pandemic. Screen fatigue, you didn't really want to see my home office anymore. And, then it kind of had some concerns as we were gathering together before vaccines were widely available. And so up to this point, it's been natural for us to really explore a text or two for more depth. But today is a little bit different. Because today we got to see the breadth across all of these readings, and we get to explore the theme that comes out of these readings. You see, most Sundays as we gather, the readings, they have a different theme, or sometimes themes, plural, that relate to the liturgical year. So today in the Lutheran Church, today's liturgical day is, anyone? Reformation Day. And it's not just Reformation Sunday, it's Reformation Day. Today is the 31st. So it's kind of a big deal again. Now, each time, on whether it's Reformation Day or Reformation Sunday, we get these exact same texts. And these texts that we read share a renewed understanding of how humankind is brought to the life of God through 4 different examples. So the first example that we'll talk about was from Psalm 46, which our choir sung today. And so in this short psalm, it begins with chaos in verse 2. Then it reminds us of God's presence among political turmoil in verses 5 through 8. And then it concludes with God's end to warfare in verses 9 through 12. It's a pretty short psalm. 3 quick movements that happen. And so with this psalm or song, we are renewed with the assurance that in the tumultuous times, God is nearby, and that God is also the harbinger of peace. Now, the other 3 readings, we're not going to go into as much depth with, but they all bring us a similar message. You see, Jeremiah is a little bit different, though, than the other 3, because this prophet is not talking about something happening there and now, or something that happened in the past, but rather he's talking about something in the future. This prophet is longing for a time where we don't need to teach and to read and to learn how to bring about God's justice and peace and love. But rather, Jeremiah is yearning for a time when everyone in the world already embodies that love and justice and peace. As you see, it's where God's life is pre-existing and fully present. It's a vision for what is to come. Well, then in John's gospel, we get to renew our understanding as Jesus proclaims that truth is not a what, but instead, truth is a who. Or another way to put that is less about the information that means truth, and it's more about the embodied relationship that is truth. And finally, although not my favorite of writers, Paul, in his letter to Romans, reminds us that we are renewed with a realization that we are brought into life of God through action and not status. So it's not where you've been born into that determines your salvation, but rather it's an action. And it's not our action, but it's God's action. You see, each of these readings are set in a different time, a different outlook, with different problems, with different social structures. But within each of these readings, God illuminates a renewed connection with God. And today, I can't help but think about our last Homecoming Sunday. That last time where we gathered for Reformation Sunday, and you all were at home. There was a few of us here. And it was just at the beginning of the worst surge that we had here in Chicagoland. Hospitals were beginning to reach capacity. The death toll was growing exponentially. The world looked quite a bit different back then, if you remember a year ago. There were no vaccines at that point approved for adults to use. And we weren't even beginning to talk about children's vaccinations. Wasn't even a thing on top of mind. And like so many of our individual lives, at that point, I think so many of us were just striving to survive and get through it all. A year later, here we are, a little bit more of a hopeful environment. We actually can turn out to church if we feel safe and comfortable to do that. We now have a majority of adults in Chicago, and all of the adults surveyed in this congregation report to be fully vaccinated. And now we have a vaccine on the horizon for children ages 5 to 11. And it's likely that in just a few days, those shots will be going into children's arms. You see, our survival is slowly giving way to a renewed sense of life. We are starting to begin to determine what it means in our own lives to kind of figure out, now that we don't need to survive anymore, what does that mean for our career? Do we really want to stick around in that particular setting? Or do we want to move to a new location? Or maybe we're trying to figure out if we want to end or start or continue or deepen a relationship that's been developing. Or maybe it's just recommitting to that which we now find has more value than it did before all of this began. And this same thing, this same figuring out now what to do as we're moving from survival to something a little more routine, that is also happening in the church. And one theologian and author, Phyllis Tickle, calls this kind of period in time in the church a holy rummage sale. And so what she means is that there are times in the church life where we need to kind of figure out, what are we going to let go of? What are we going to hold on to? And what then are we going to need to reform or reimagine? And all of that work, this holy rummage sale, is to think about how we can better connect with God. And the thing is that Phyllis, when she was writing this book well before the pandemic, she talked about how about every 500 years this happens. So we had Jesus, then we had the time when Christianity was finally legalized, then we had time when there was the great schism between the Western Church and the Eastern Church, then we had the time when there was the Protestant Reformation, and now she, as she was writing, was saying, we are on the edge of the next new change and time for a holy rummage sale. Now, I would argue that whether we like it or not, this next decade, this is the holy rummage sale. The pandemic turned everything upside down. How we do church, how we do work, how we do relationships, all different. And so whether we like it or not, we are amid God's reformation. And 504 years ago to the day, or at least as the story goes, there was a German monk who volunteered at a similar rummage sale. And he decided to write down 95 points that he wanted to discuss. Now, some of those things he wanted to toss out. Some of those things he said, this is important for us to keep as a church. And there were other things where he said, this has got to change. Doesn't really fall in alignment. Now, that beer-drinking professor, well, he decided to tack up his talking points on a church door, and this was part of the movement that we now call the Protestant Reformation, of course. And that man was who? Martin Luther. I'm telling you a story you probably already know, the namesake, of course, of our denomination. All right, so I've thrown a lot at you in the sermon, and I've kind of gone bouncing around a little bit. So if you're in my head, which, bless you, if you ever try to figure out what's going through my mind, Alex will tell you it is complicated and nearly impossible. But nevertheless, in my mind, what I'm trying to hold together here today is I'm kind of thinking about Martin Luther and that last Holy Rummage Sale. I'm also trying to ponder the last year of our lives and how things are different today than they were a year ago. And then I'm also trying to hold those 4 visions in Scriptures, the reminders of the way that God meets us in a specific time, a specific place, a specific social location, to then renew our connection with God's work. And so with all of that said, I think the question for you and me today is, are you ready for the rummage sale? Like, in honor of that beer-guzzling monk, I want you to look in your bulletin right now, and there are some sticky notes there. And for those of you who are on Congregation Council, you know I love a good sticky note. So go ahead, pull them out. I know they're there. Vicar put them there this morning. Thank you, sir. And there, I'd invite you to grab one of the pens in the pew. I didn't tell you that I was going to put you to work, so hopefully you listen to the first part, or this next half is going to be real tough. But I would invite you to ponder the question, what do we need to keep? What do we need to toss? What do we need to rebuild in the church to better connect with God's work in this time and this place? So on each sticky note, just kind of write one thing, and you probably have 3 or 4 sticky notes in there. Something that the church needs to toss, something that the church needs to keep, or something that we need to rebuild so that we can best participate in God's work. Now, the thing is on those sticky notes, you're also going to have to say, we want to toss this, right? Or we want to keep this, or we want to rebuild this. And then on your way out, I'm going to invite you to tack those notes on the door, just like Martin Luther did. Tack them on these doors in here. Give it to the man good, right? Stick it to the man, stick it on the door, show him where this rummage sale might lead. Now, if you're joining us online, as many of you are, you can go ahead and drop those in the chat as well. I'm going to go back and look at all of them. So drop them in the chat. It's a little less anonymous if you're online, since you probably have your name. But in this brainstorming, there's nothing that's wrong. So if you're having trouble thinking about what to keep, what to toss, what to rebuild, I'm going to show you a few of my sticky notes back here. So the first one on my sticky note is I want to keep that expansive and unending love of God. I think that's been a big thing here at Wicker Park Lutheran Church, constantly expanding the welcome, expanding the table. Who's on the outside? How can we bring them in? I think in the rummage sale, that's what I want to keep. Now, one of the things that I want to toss right out of the door here is the ways that our church, the ELCA, has continued to build up and support systems of racial oppression. From things like potlucks where Jell-O salad is the only thing that we can ever think of instead of tamales or fried chicken or any of the lovely dishes that come from around our world. I want to get rid of it. Now, there are some things that I think that we need to rebuild in our church. Things that I think as an earlier church, we actually got better than we do now. And that's thinking about creation. Thinking about how our actions impact systems, ecosystems, other people. So I think that we need to think about how we can better care for God's gifts. And I could keep going. I actually came up with 6 here. I want to keep God's abundant grace. I'm ready to toss out the door sexism and heterosexism. I'm ready to rebuild the way that we do sermons. The ways that you sit there in pews like that, looking at me, instead of like we kind of do in schools, or at least pre-COVID, right? Where we have clusters and we gather together in cohorts and to discuss and to discern. I want to rethink that. I think we can do better. And so as you write down what you think, remember that you're not alone. Remember the psalmist who was renewed in the knowledge of God's presence. Remember Jeremiah, who imagined God's love beyond knowledge when it was just embedded in our hearts from the very beginning. Remember Jesus, who renewed our understandings of embodied, relational, incarnate truth. Remember Paul, who renewed our understanding that it's not about what we do, but it's what God has done. Yes, this holy rummage sale, this work is difficult. Wasn't easy for Luther, wasn't easy 500 years before that, and before that, and before that. It's work. And the thing about this holy rummage sale, much like Luther over 500 years ago, the outcome, what you think the outcome is probably going to be, probably won't actually turn out the way you thought. I mean, remember, Martin Luther didn't want a whole Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther wanted to do the holy rummage sale with the Holy Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church. And it went a little different. But the thing is as we do this holy rummaging, as we start getting ready to get rid of things, we know that we're in good company. For Luther, for Paul, for Jesus, for Jeremiah, and for the psalmist, they have all been right where we are. This exact moment. And the two things that I think we can walk away with and remember in this rummage sale: God is ever present. We remember it from the psalmist. God is forever present in the turmoil, the waves, the strife. And that God is with us in this journey. God is here in the people in this place and in this holy meal that strengthens us on this journey. And so, friends, today, let us give thanks for God's holy rummage sale. And I hope you start tacking up your ideas, for these are the gifts of God for the people of God. Amen.